Action Project and others to form it. We co-joined this with Pacific Charnstein and Ian Barry. But the fisherman said, if there are no mangroves, the sea will have no meaning. It's like having a tree without roots, for the mangroves are the roots of the sea. That expression, you see, roots of the sea, comes from him, and the actual inspiration for forming Mangrove Action Project came from his words. Just to let you know, we started with a Muslim fisherman in southern Thailand with those inspiring words that made me get involved in this issue for over almost 3 decades now. My wife Monica Gutierrez Quarto did this painting. It was a 4-foot by 6-foot painting, a beautiful painting. Unfortunately, we lost it. We was auctioned off to a person when she died. People take the estate, took it, and threw it away. We think we don't know what happened to it. It was a beautiful shot, and unfortunately, it's much more colorful in person. This doesn't do it justice, but still, you see in this painting the life of the mangroves. And when Monica did this, we had her, I think it was 2-year-old son, maybe 1.5-year-old son, crawling on the floor, and she's trying to paint, and she'd have to work with him and then go back to the painting. I think it took her a couple of months, Monica, was it? A couple of months to do that? I think so. And then we put it on our stationery, and all. We had a lot of use of that. And people picked this up from around the world and used that. But it shows you all the life in the mangroves and how important the mangroves are. Now, the rainforest by the sea, again, mangroves are the interface between land and ocean. They are the barrier between heavy waves and winds and so on. They protect the soils, many more functions that the mangroves have that at the time when I started Mangrove Action Project, people didn't know about, didn't think about. The mangrove valuation was like maybe $600 to $700 per hectare. Shrimp farms are worth $2,000 or more per hectare, so it was always shrimp farms are worth more than mangroves. That changed after the tsunami, where shrimp farms were seen as actually negative value because of the restoration needs. And mangroves went way up in value to like $19,000, $20,000 per hectare. Mangroves are found in the tropics and subtropics around the world. We have them in Florida. They're in Texas, California, has some even in Southern California, there's small ones. But mainly in the southern hemisphere, like Mexico, south into South America, and also in Australia, New Zealand has them, Africa, and Asia, and much more in Asia. That's the largest percentage of mangroves. These are some of the different services that mangroves provide, including ecotourism. People need to get into mangroves to see more about them. They're really interesting. Fishermen use the mangroves. I heard millions of dollars spent by fly fishermen to visit mangrove areas to fish. A lot of times people don't understand the value of mangroves. They're so important for purifying the heavy metals out of water, for keeping the land intact. They can accrue soil, so as sea level rises, mangroves actually are first line of defense against sea level rise. First line of defense against climate change as well, because they sequester huge amounts of carbon. This is in Burma, or Myanmar, which is endangered now. But basically, the mangrove is like a wall, it's a living buffer against waves and winds. So when you have a tsunami, it's not going to necessarily protect you, but it will slow down that wave possibly if it's enough mangrove buffer left intact. But winds, hurricane winds and so on, mangroves are very important. So 100 meters, I've heard, of mangrove will stop a wave, reduce its energy by 80% or more. So this says 66%, but I know it reduces the energy of that wave and can protect the people that live in those areas. This is in Tanzania. We were recently there at a workshop training people for restoration work. But around the world, mangroves are being seen more and more as important. Local people definitely have seen the problems that have arisen when they lost their mangroves. Obviously, wave actions is one issue that's more and more important. I was recently in the Maldives, and there in the Maldives, the sea level is really coming up high, and there's only a meter above sea level of the islands. They're kind of a flat island chain. They're island atoll, coral reef mainly. And the mangroves are there. It's a very unique system of mangroves. But when the sea level rises, it'll be very hard to protect those kinds of places. And this is happening around the world. Even in the US, we're going to see some real problems with coastal cities because of sea level rise. Now here's an area of Indonesia. You can imagine what this was like when the tsunami hit. If this was out a mangrove buffer, which should have been there before the shrimp farms and other developments, the people living behind those mangroves might have been more safe from that tsunami. But because of the destruction of the coastal wetlands, the tsunami and hurricane winds and so on that happen nowadays, are causing more and more havoc, more and more destruction of the local people and the communities that live there. We're seeing this time and again now. I've been to Malaysia and other places, Vietnam, where they have now built walls to protect the cities against storms after taking down the mangroves. They're replanting mangroves now in front of the walls to protect the walls from the sea level and the waves. This is how crazy we are. We destroyed the actual buffer that was there originally, replace it now with a wall, and then we have to protect the wall now with the mangrove by replanting mangroves outside the wall. This is a craziness that we're facing around the world. You can see here, this is in Australia, but the living buffer of the mangroves, it will protect those soils, protect that inland area from these kinds of invasions of salt water. They protect it from salinization of the freshwater systems. Fish use the mangroves. They can go up these channels and basically breed and multiply and come back to the sea. It's an amazing place if you ever get a chance to go into mangrove areas. In fact, how many people here have been in the mangroves? I presume that some of you have. I know Tom, you've been there. So good. It's a very important ecosystem anyway. It's starting to get the importance known since 2004. Unfortunately, an Indian Ocean tsunami had to happen before people started taking the mangroves seriously. They sequester 5 times, I've heard 10 times sometimes, amount of carbon from any other forest project or ecosystem. Salt flats, marshlands, seagrasses, they're all really important for sequestering carbon and storing that carbon. Mangroves are one of the best sources of carbon sequestration and storage. They can store the carbon for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years, in their soils. I've heard people tell stories of taking soil samples 3 meters deep and coming up with leaves that are still intact or branches still intact. It presses down into the soils and keeps them from decomposing. Unfortunately, when those soils are disturbed, that's released. So the mangrove sink becomes a carbon source, I should say. The mangrove becomes the carbon source of pollution at that point. And again, you see some of these statistics here, but basically having a healthy mangrove can help us sustain ourselves against climate change. It can be one of the things we should be doing today. Not just mangrove, but any forest can be basically restored, maintained, and conserved will help us fight climate change. It's one of the best things we can do besides cutting emissions. We have to restore these ecosystems. Now, the mangrove roots, they breathe at low tide. I was in Andaman Islands after the tsunami, and some of the island had tilted because of the earthquake. And where it tilted into the water, the roots couldn't breathe, and the mangroves all died along the shoreline. And one of the reasons they died is they drowned. The forest department there in Andaman Islands, basically thought they drowned or they died because they were frightened from the earthquake. The earthquake frightened the trees to death. And we saw right away the problem was not fright, it was basically tilting of that island. This is something we have to really educate not only the communities, not only the general public, but also the so-called experts, the ones who manage these forests, need to be educated themselves on the ecology of mangroves. This is very important. Carbon sequestration, like I mentioned, when they're destroyed, a lot of that carbon is released. Since 2010, I think it was, up there it says, so much, 207 million tons of carbon, I think, was released because of that. 122 million tons. This is not good. We're basically causing more climate change problems by destroying these mangrove forests. We're losing every year about less than 1% now. It's about 100,000 hectares of mangrove forest. That's like over 200,000 acres per year being lost. And we can't afford to do that. It's like 240,000 acres a year being lost. And it's a lot of mangrove carbon being released because of that lost. Especially when they dig the shrimp farms, they dig about 1.5 meters deep. All that soil, which is rich in carbon, is being forced to release its carbon to the atmosphere. Wildlife is very much affected by mangrove loss as well. Many endangered species, migratory birds, for instance, around the world depend on mangrove forest. And this is one problem we need to face is loss of, Monica, can I go to the next one? The Bengal tiger in Bangladesh and India is being lost because of loss of its habitat. Monica? Yeah. And the dugong and the manatee, these are animals that depend on the mangrove, but they eat the seagrasses. Mangroves protect the seagrass from sedimentation and from pollution, as well as the coral reef. They all depend on each other because of interaction. And this interaction is very important to maintain. We want to have healthy coral reef, healthy seagrasses, and so on. The proboscis monkey is in Borneo and places in Indonesia, and these are endangered as well. Sea turtles, another endangered species, basically are a commercial fishery that depends on mangroves. The fish we eat, the fish we depend upon in the world, especially in the communities that live on these types of sustainable sustenance diets, basically fishing from the sea. This is lemon shark. We saw these when we were in Bimini Island. And Bimini Island has a lot of development from tourism now. And Hemingway wrote a book called Islands in the Sea. And basically, islands in the stream, I should say, islands in the stream. And after visiting Bimini, I would call it now islands in the extreme, basically, because it's being torn into a tourist habitat. Mangroves are being lost for golf courses and developments of hotels and so on. Habitat for many of the nurseries for fish, including the rays here. You'll see these around the world where the mangroves are. There's very important habitat for the small fish that go into the mangrove roots at high tide, and they can hide in those roots from the bigger fish, and they can grow up into basically their adult sizes by feeding in the mangrove areas. And people depend on mangroves too. This is one thing that local communities are really being hit hard by developments in their mangrove areas. They're losing their fishing, they're losing their ability to get fresh water. The shrimp farms, for instance, leach the salt water from the ponds into the surrounding area, which causes their wells to go saline. People had to truck in water kilometers away from where they live in order to have fresh water. They couldn't grow their gardens anymore, they couldn't feed their livestock anymore. Whole communities had to move because of this problem. So we could eat shrimp in the richer countries. So people in the southern nations were losing their ability to survive, while we could dine on these shrimp as a luxury product. Nowadays, shrimp is less of a problem as far as the expansion. It's still a big problem in certain countries like Myanmar, Indonesia, Honduras, and so on. There's still shrimp expansion there, where the farms are expanding into mangrove areas, but it's reduced now, and it's less destructive as it was before. Some of the big destructions nowadays are tourism developments and other kinds of industries. But people still can live in the mangrove areas in harmony. As you see here, these people are growing oysters there with these ropes across the water. So as tides come in, the oyster basically attaches itself to those lines. They can harvest those oysters for their livelihood and for their sustenance. Schools of fish depend on the mangrove. They come into the mangroves at high tide, live in there and escape from the bigger fish. They can grow up again in size and nourish themselves on the detritus of the mangrove. Which feeds the food chain. Commercial fishing depends on mangroves because the small fish become the bigger fish that we depend on for commercial fisheries. So this is all a cycle. We don't want to disturb. We want to try to maintain and to improve upon. We can by restoring those areas. And again, I mentioned local people are dependent upon mangroves for many reasons. For medicines, they use the bark or the leaves and so on to make fruit from the mangrove trees themselves. For lumber, for fuel wood, many factors they use the mangrove forest for. And this is just a shot of it. Some fishermen in Bangladesh trained these sea otters to actually help fish for them. They help chase the fish into the nets. This is kind of an odd shot in there. And the people gather shellfish. Like the mangrove, in a sense, is a supermarket for the local people. In a sense, they can get everything they need there for fuel wood, lumber, medicines, fruit, the food from the mangroves is all there for them. Fishermen, when the mangroves are healthy, can fish closer to the shore. They don't have to go so far out to sea, which is dangerous. So oftentimes when the mangroves are destroyed, they have to go further and further to sea. And a lot of fishermen have lost their lives in hurricane or storms anyway. And plus they can spend more time with their families as well. Basically, people come into the mangrove areas now, eco-tourists. There's more tourists going to the mangroves because they're very interesting for bird watching, for instance. Many species of bird come there. Beautiful for going through to high tide with a small boat and going through the different channels that are there. And we endorse the idea of walkways in the mangroves. People can actually walk back into the mangrove areas and see firsthand what's going on in there. Hear the crabs and the shrimp clicking and see the crab like this. and see the birds and so on. So we're trying to educate people more on the mangroves because there's such an obscure place for many people who don't get there, don't realize how valuable they are, how unique they are. If we get more people to see them and understand them, I think we'll make some progress and avoid this kind of problems we see here, where, like I say, about 100 and some thousand acres of mangroves are being lost every year, hectares I should say, about 250,000 acres a year being lost. This is not a good thing. You see here the losses, you see mainly in Asia, is where the most mangroves exist, and the losses are huge there. Oddly enough, I noticed just today, actually 2008 and 9, it went way up in 2009. I'm wondering if that's because Thailand went down in this shrimp farming. This has started having problems with diseases. And when Thailand went down in shrimp farming, India, Indonesia, Bangladesh, other countries jumped in, or Vietnam, they jumped in there to establish more shrimp farms to take advantage of the market demand that was in the US and Europe for shrimp in Japan. So the other countries jumped in there, and that's, I think, the spike you see in the mangrove losses. Because most of the losses are happening today in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Myanmar today. This is the countries that, again, really running into the business of shrimp farms because they can sell the shrimp at high prices to us.
Just a question there on that slide.
Yeah.
North America, does that include Central America?
I think it does. That is actually the same thing. I think it must include Central America. But we are losing mangroves in Florida too, and in the US as well from developments. Even Sylvester Stallone was arrested for cutting his mangroves down at his place in Florida. He wanted the view, and he got fined for that, so probably a slap on the wrist for him. But you see a lot of mangrove losses in the US because of developments. That's a good point, though, about Central America. That does include.
Yeah.
And you see this kind of scene when I was in Thailand. This is what I saw. And these are protected lands. This is the thing about this is so ironic and so sad, is that the laws exist in the books, very strongly stated laws, but laws mean nothing on paper. They got to be enforced. This is a problem worldwide. There's not enforcement happening for this kind of ecosystem protection. So we have laws oftentimes that are just totally ignored. Bribes and convenience make it easy for people to develop these areas. Shrimp farms like this are extensive in Brazil, Thailand. This is in Thailand. You'll see this kind of scene throughout the industrial world where shrimp farms are taking place. Half those ponds you see there are probably empty. There's about 250,000 just in hectares of shrimp farms abandoned in Asia alone. We figure about 500,000 worldwide of abandoned shrimp farms. Abandoned because of disease and problems with pollution. The shrimp start dying. And after a while, they move the ponds to another place. So they keep moving. It's kind of like this rape and burn type of situation where they keep moving forward with their ponds to new places, less pollution, less disease, but then it continues to follow them as they go. So you'll see half these ponds empty, and worldwide, like I said, it's about 500,000 hectares of abandoned shrimp farms that we're trying to get a hold of to restore. This is Bibbini Island again, the island in the extreme. They're tearing down all the mangroves to build their hotels there. This is a really sad scene to see. The people have no say. The developers are from other countries. They're not from that area, but they convince the people they're going to provide jobs, and most of the jobs aren't actually going to the local people, they're going to outsiders because they're more dependable for workers. Charcoal is one of the big issues now in Myanmar, but just recently, shrimp farms have spread in Myanmar very big time. In this one very remote area of Myanmar that was a reserve for the mangroves. It also over 80% of the mangroves are ready to rice farming and shrimp farms. So now it's moving to the last stand of the mangroves in Myanmar. It's very hard to stop this because of the corruption, basically. And this is, I just got back from here. This is Fushi, which is very hard to say, but I can say it a little bit. But this airport runway was right through the mangrove lagoon. This was all mangrove at one time, all connected here. And they put the runway right through it. And very crazily, they have a place where they have an airport 20 minutes away by boat. So they could have avoided this and kept their mangrove intact. Instead, they built this runway just in 2017. We were invited there to basically assess the remaining mangroves because the local people were complaining the smell, the fish die off, and the flooding that might ensue. They wanted to reclaim the whole area, which means fill in the area, kill all the mangroves, and build housing and hotels there, right next to the runway. We're saying this is not a good idea because these small islands have a small number of mangroves, but these areas are vital because this is part of the recharge for the fresh water systems for these places, the groundwater for people to drink. And if they pave this over, they won't have that anymore. They'll have to have desalination plants. So we saw these problems. We tried to convince the government, talk to the Minister of the Environment, to try to actually save these areas that still exist if they can. Try to design some system that will basically drain out the floodwaters and allow the mangroves to survive and continue their function, even though in a limited way now because of this crazy runway. And it still hasn't been finished. It's just a project that ended in September, I think 2017 or so. It just sits there idle. You still have to take the airplane to the other island and take a boat to get to there. So it's unfortunate. They talk about making this a second Mali, which is, we don't want a second Mali. The first Mali is bad enough. Mali is the capital of the Maldives, and it's just a mess. It's just a total overpacked, polluted place, and you don't want to create another one of those. So now we get into the issue of trying to change the attitude of people's attitude towards mangroves, because oftentimes there's the wrong idea of what mangrove actually is. It's a swampy, polluted, mosquito-infested area. This is all a misnomer. It's basically giving mangroves a bad name. We're trying to change that, give them a good name now, for good reasons. Right now, we're seeing partnerships possible with other groups like Apple just recently funded Conservation International into a 27,000-acre reserve in Colombia, trying to restore and conserve this area in Colombia. So we're seeing big money now going into mangroves because of the climate change issue mainly, because the climate change and what's called blue carbon is starting to pique interest of the industries that want to get that carbon offset. And I want to do another show before another video, but we're talking about restoration now. This is very important. We're trying to basically restore the mangroves in an effective way because they're being restored in a very bad way now. They're planting by hand everywhere. And the mangroves are not surviving by and large, they're dying. About 70 to 75%, if not more, failure rate. We don't have time to fail, we need to do it right. So we're trying to promote a method we call a community-based ecological mangrove restoration method, CBEMR. It's basically using nature to work with nature, not against it. So we try to work with the more holistic approach. The voice is not playing.
It's got the music.
It's got the music, but not the voice. That's right.
Oh my God. Can we?
I don't know why.
Yeah.
Maybe there's two modes.
Maybe we can.
I don't know. I can tell there's I can try to explain it anyway. But the people living in the coastal areas depend on the fishery, basically. So they're trying to show in this video the importance of the mangroves for the local communities. This is one thing we need to understand. About 210 million people live in the mangrove areas, depending on those for their livelihood and for their sustenance. So without those mangroves, without the roots of the mangrove protecting them, they're losing out in their cultures and their ability to survive. So this is one of the problems. These are aerators in a shrimp farm, trying to keep the shrimp farm aerated for the shrimp to be healthy. But by raising the shrimp, they're killing the actual mangrove and killing the local people's ability to have food security, taking away their traditional livelihoods and traditional food sources. So this is basically trying to show the need to restore those mangroves, how important they are to the local people. Local fishermen, crab catchers, people that depend on the sea for their lifeblood basically need this. We don't need the shrimp in the north. We didn't have shrimp 20 years ago, 30 years ago anyway. We had some, but it wasn't like we have today. It's the number one seafood today in the U.S. Our number one seafood is coming from these kinds of operations that are killing the mangrove forest. Let's try the voice bubble.
Yeah,
Is there something you can do? plant mangroves. One of the problems we see here is that they're planting mangroves in a mudflat, which is not where they belong. Mangroves belong in a mangrove type of terrain. They don't grow in mudflats because it's too low in the sea level. When the tide comes in, they're standing in water too long, the flow of water is too strong oftentimes, and they'll die. You'll see acres and acres of these kinds of operations with dead mangroves about 6 months later or so. You're spending millions of dollars on this kind of operation, this kind of attempt to restore. They call it restoration. It's not restoration at all. It's hand planting. We call it gardening approach to mangrove restoration. The gardening approach does not work. Mangroves don't belong in this kind of system. They grow in zones. They grow in certain levels with the sea. And that's Jim Enright in Thailand is one of the lead coordinators of the work we do in Thailand. But the fact is, though, these trees, when they're planted like this, may look good for the first year, but if you go back there in another year, or maybe even 6 months, you'll find 90% are dead.
Maybe we can hear you, but
You hear it? Yeah, it's too low.
These are all really quite small sites, and our mission is basically
Try to do that.
showing that these ponds can be restored.
A lot of research and analysis is involved at the start of any project. Knowledge of the local species,
Can you hear it?
the waterways and tides
The volume needs to go up.
It's too low, yeah.
is all taken into consideration
Anyway, so
for development.
that's okay. So the people living here basically need to have the mangroves restored. And what's happening is the abandoned shrimp farms are basically begging for our attention because they can be restored back to mangroves again. They're doing nothing, they're sitting idle. And they're collecting actually fresh water, which causes the mosquito that carries malaria and dengue to form. The seawater does not produce the mosquito that we worry about. It produces mosquitoes, but not the worrisome mosquitoes. Fresh water is where we come up with mosquitoes that are dangerous, the malarial and the dengue type mosquito. So this we're trying to basically inform people, it's better to have your mangroves and mosquitoes than not to have them have fresh water areas. So we're trying to restore those mangroves back to health again. And basically using a technique we call the ecological mangrove restoration technique.
What's it called?
You can read this at least.
Did you say that name again?
What's the technique called?
Ecological mangrove restoration, basically community-based ecological mangrove restoration. Community-based is very important. As we're trying to get community involved, because they're the ones that are true stewards of these areas. If they're involved and have an ownership of that management, it will have a successful restoration. If they're not involved and kept out of it by government or industries, then we'll see the mangroves disappear.
ทรัพยากรอย่างอื่นเนี่ยมันก็จะได้สมบูรณ์ไปด้วยแล้วก็ชาวบ้านที่จะประกอบอาชีพต่างๆเนี่ยก็จะมีรายได้เพิ่มขึ้นจากที่ไปจับสัตว์น้ำ
Monitoring and training workshops are held regularly with community members throughout the project to ensure a successful restoration whilst developing sustainable, locally led conservation initiatives to benefit the communities and to take pressure off existing them.
So working with local people, we try to get them involved and make them more aware so they become better managers. One thing we need to do is have them actually sustain the monitoring in those areas, to monitor what's happening with their mangroves and police the area in a sense too, where they can actually find people that are violating the rules and stop them.
Are you hiring them?
No, we're getting local people to do this on their own. And in fact, one of the villages we went to in Thailand, the principal, the school teacher of the school, took boats out with people and actually policed the area and stopped people that were illegal fishing. And it was pretty amazing.
See what happened.
Good thinking.
Very smart. That's why we need people
Who's
to
the speaker?
ก็ได้สร้างอาชีพได้สร้างรายได้ให้กับรัฐที่มาอยู่รัฐแล้ว
I don't think it's going through.
ถ้าหากว่าจะให้
I could go get a check person here a little bit, but
You already got the
Yeah,
right person.
this is almost over anyway. One of the things we're doing is working with local people, alternative livelihoods. Like, it turns out mangroves produce flowers all year round pretty much. So beekeeping can be real productive with local people to raise honey. And they make soaps out of the honey. They make honey they sell at the hotels nearby. So they collect the honey, and there's like 200 or more hives in this one village. They're teaching other villages nearby now, which is the same thing. So it's actually producing an alternative source of income. by keeping the mangroves healthy, these people have more income. So it's an encouragement to them.
With 10% of the profits going straight back into the community conservation fund. And their activities with neighbouring communities interested in learning their new skills, and visitors coming from around the globe to see their project and buy their products.
Is it coming through? It's not very loud.
No. Yeah, I think we can basically stop now and I'll go back to my presentation. It's a good video, and you can get this on our website if you want to see this on our website. So
It's a great video.
you'll hear it better, because it's a good educational video. And there's a lot of videos made about mangroves. The thing about mangroves is they're really being looked at by many more people today. There's really some excellent videos that you can find on the websites if you want to look at mangrove. So this is what I'm talking about, the restoration that's going on worldwide. There's been instances of mass plantings with Guinness World Records being set. It used to be 1 million trees planted in one day. It got up to 3 million mangrove seedlings basically planted in one day. Using villages, like 300 or more villages, got together and they kept planting all day long, broke the record. So the Guinness World was out there using a big chart, big medal, whatever it is, of honor. But a year later, those mangroves were all dead. Nobody goes back to check on the status of those mangroves a year later. And the people that were involved in organizing this are embarrassed by it, so they say, yeah, it was successful. But you have to send somebody out to these remote areas to find this and report on it. And we haven't been able to do that. We really want to be able to judge these kinds of restoration efforts and assess them, because they're being repeated over and over again, the same mistakes. Unless we can assess them and publicize the problems and come up with the best management practices, we're going to keep losing out. We're losing time, and it's an important time to not lose with climate change.
You have a question?
Huh?
There's a question.
Oh, okay, yeah?
Is, for the carbon credits, is there anything in there about success or anything like that, or is it just event-based? You do the thing, and then regardless of outcomes, you get the credits? How does that work?
It's been hard to get carbon credits for mangroves because they're basically, they call it blue carbon. But they don't like to carbon credit restoration so much as, or conservation, I should say. They don't carbon credit conservation so recently. They're starting to do it now with Apple and CI, Conservation International. They're finally giving carbon credits for conserving a mangrove. They used to do it for replanting them, I think it was, replanting mangroves, which was, in a sense, favoring plantations. And one thing I haven't mentioned yet, I should mention, there's about 70 species of mangrove worldwide. Places like Indonesia may have 40 to 50 species, but they only replant one species. It's just a monoculture, basically. They plant the Rhizophora, which is a red mangrove, it's called. We have that in Florida, the ones with the propers. These. This is so common to see, the Rhizophora planted everywhere. And they plant them oftentimes in the wrong zone, too close to the sea level, or to the water's edge, where the tide comes in. They're not growing healthily. The crabs sometimes eat them. The wave action is too strong oftentimes for them. And sometimes the salinity is too high. I was in India, and the Indian scientists were telling me they were planting Rhizophora. They kept dying because it was too high saline. The Avicennia were growing healthily because Avicennia are more salt tolerant. So I said to the scientists, why don't you grow Avicennia? Because that's what they're here for. They can stand the salt. They said, no, we want Rhizophora. Oh. And in fact, one of the scientists actually had the theory that the Avicennia were killing Rhizophora because of some poisons they were releasing. Totally crazy ideas again, but this is the kind of thinking. And the World Bank's funding these kinds of programs to the hundreds of millions of dollars. Because the scientists go there with a proposal, we'll plant 5,000 acres of mangroves, give us $1 million. Say, okay, here, do it. And they plant them. It gets so bad that when I first started Mangrove Restoration Project in 1992, in 1993, I talked to Gordon Claridge, who was a consultant in Australia, hired by Thailand to look at the mangrove restoration program they had there. The World Bank had granted them like $500 million for 5 years. So every year they had to plant 100,000 hectares of mangroves. To do that, they cut healthy mangrove forests so they can restore them with a monoculture. And Gordon complained to me saying, he's the consultant, he can't outright speak about this in front of the public, but this is what they're doing. And I publicized this back then, and he was really happy that I did it. He gave me the information, from his reports. And when they found out that he leaked this to me, they were really angry at him. But this is the kind of thing we see worldwide. They're destroying healthy mangrove forests to replant them now. And this is one of the problems of the carbon credit, because I think people might start doing that as well. Yeah.
If you look at the underlying issue, when you say the World Bank or the IMF provides that kind of funding, they know that's going to fail, because that puts more debt on the country, and that's what their ultimate goal is, to put the debt on the country, get them to the point where they have to capitulate, sign over control of people and resources. That's the agenda, so there's a function to the dysfunctionality. That's the kind of thing that has to be exposed.
But the funders also, other funders like Packard Foundation and so on, they'll fund programs like that, not Packard so much, but other big foundations that aren't World Bank will do the same. They'll fund for 1 year only, fund a restoration like you see here, and then go away, and then they'll come back to see if it's successful. There's not that follow-up, which we really need follow-up, because we're losing a chance to do it right. And we're producing what we call the best practice method. We think our method is best practices, because we work holistically with nature. The nature we plant, because mangrove seedlings float on the incoming tides, and they plant themselves. They can actually sustain themselves for a full year on the ocean currents. I think it started in Indonesia, the mangrove, as a species, and it went from Indonesia, Thailand, that area, Malaysia, and it went around the world, to Africa, to the US, to South America, and so on, by floating on the tides, going from island to island or continent to continent. And now we have the mangroves as we see them today. But the main variety of mangroves is in the Southeast Asia. That's where the majority of them are. But you can see from the past chart I showed you, majority are being lost as well in those places really rapidly. Yeah. Here people are planting again. This is probably one of those World Bank, or not World Bank, but Guinness World Records, where people are out there diligently planting mangroves as fast as they can do it to beat the record. But a year later, if you go to the same site, you'll see destruction. Nothing's going on. In fact, they're probably ruining the mudflat, which is an important ecosystem on itself. The birds feed in the mudflat. There's a lot of shellfish that feed in the mudflat. So the mudflat has its own function, but it's an easy place to plant. Yeah, Tom?
Yeah, I saw Vietnam was that they were not only planting monoculture, but the planting was closest together and maximize the number of seedings they can get in done. They were competing with each other in the growth.
And we see this being, if you see East May or other scientific journals, even the MFF and Mangroves for the Future, we have pictures of this kind of thing, because they want the pictures of the local people planting mangroves. In Thailand is a place that the children are brought out to plant mangroves in the same place every year, because they die, and then the children come back the next year because the photo, the king wants the photos of kids planting mangroves in Thailand, but it doesn't work as we're doing it. So we're trying to say, stop this kind of craziness and do it right. Here again, you see examples, acres and acres of this kind of plantation. I visited a place in, I think it was El Salvador, and the people there were planting mangroves in the same place 4 times. And I walked around the areas like this. This is a mudflat. And right nearby, there's a stream, underground stream. You can see where the stream went. You don't see the water, but you can see where the line of that stream was. There was mangroves growing along that area. And I walked down and went up to my knee in mud. So this is where the mangroves belong. This is where they are growing normally. And they're not growing here because it was hard-packed mudflat. It was amazing that I had to tell them this. After 4 times they failed, but they don't understand the value of mudflat. They see a mudflat as an easy place to stick your propagule or seedling into the ground. And they plant it there and they see it grow maybe for the first 6 months or so, but then it's dead. So how can we deal with this kind of ignorance, basically? In one way, and as well, deal with the fact that the World Bank and other funders are funding this kind of ignorance, because they're ignorant themselves of the problems. They don't understand it. They want to see the pictures of people planting because it looks good for their funding donors.
So I'm wondering if anybody's heard about this, but I ran across recently, they're using drones to plant trees, and they've yelled out drones, and I think they're firing seeds in little bullets out there, but they say, wow, this is going to be solving the problem. I'm just curious if anybody, if you run into that. Or
yeah, they're doing it with mangroves as well. They take the propagules and shoot them down, like you said, the bullet. And it depends where they put them, but as well, they're going to be too close together probably. And who's going to go there to monitor that area to see that's the right spot and it's actually succeeding? I think it's a waste of the fuel for the, well, not the fuel, it's the drone, but whatever they're doing, it could be done better. It could be done better. What we try to do, and our method I should talk about more when we go to this slide, is the restoration of the hydrology. Because the hydrology is what was disturbed in the first place. Without the hydrological restoration, it's going to fail. Also, you have to find out what's causing the mangrove loss in the first place. Is it sheep grazing there, goats grazing? Is it people walking in their fishing boats dragged across the mangroves? People harvesting shrimp farms? What is the reason your mangroves died in the first place? It's like having a fishbowl with goldfish, and you have a fish died. You put it in the goldfish, it dies. Find out what's killing the fish before you put more fish in there. So why are we doing this with mangroves? We're putting the mangroves back and they're dying a number of times before we say we're failing. And I've seen this over and over again, this failure of restoration.
It seems to me it's the same problem that a lot of terrestrial reforestation programs fail because it's linear thinking imposed on the land. It's not based on ecological realities.
Exactly.
It's not based on local knowledge, observation, and seeing the different zones of where the different species grow. It's some academic bureaucrat from some distant country coming with an idea.
We have also all the time have problems getting funding because we're told by people wanting to restore, how many mangroves are we planting per hectare? I said, we don't plant them, we let them come back on their own. I said, we can't fund that then because that doesn't give us a number. We need a number of mangroves. They still give an estimate, they say. So we say 1,000 mangroves will come back in a year. We don't know, but they want that number. Even then they don't fund us. So we're having problems getting funding to do it right because the funders want to do it wrong because it's easier for them to promote it the wrong way.
It's like the Mother Nature. We want to replicate kind of Mother Nature does, and that is really hard to put kind of.
This has been a frustration for us from the beginning anyways, is the lack of support for doing it right. We developed kind of a more holistic approach. We do education, conservation and restoration, work with local people, local communities. We raise awareness, we do advocacy as well. You know, the reason I went to the Maldives, because I kept writing letters to the president of the Maldives, don't build that airport there, it's not a good place for it. Finally, I got a response from the Minister of the Environment, Dr. Hassan. I called him on the phone with my wife's WhatsApp, and I said, I want to talk to you about the mangroves. And we talked for half an hour. Next day, he talks to the newspapers and say, we're going to invite MAP over to the Maldives to assess our mangroves. It was amazing to me because it was just a fluke that he'd find us, but it took a phone call only. So I think it's important to be more direct with these government officials and ask if we can intervene. So I belong to a group called the Mangrove Specialist Group, even though I'm not a scientist, but scientists belong to that group, so we have experts from around the world. I'm not sure, Tom, if you're a member of that, but Mangrove Specialist Group is a very important organization for people that have knowledge about mangroves. So we invited 2 specialists over to the Maldives as well with my team, and we're able to look at the mangroves and assess them and go back to the government with information was factual, not myths or not wrong information. And so we're starting to make some progress, yeah.
Yeah, maybe you're going to get to, are you going to get into how you restore the hydrology? Because,
That's coming.
This also reminds me of the event-based versus process-based restoration shift in riparian. And in that case, it's like, oftentimes you just need to create beaver habitat, and then you get the keystone element back, a lot like returning fire to the landscape. So yeah, and then I'm curious too, how does the community restoration model, what sort of monitoring, what does monitoring do, especially if you're planting in the wrong place?
Exactly. This is one important part of the talk.
Great.
Yeah. So our CBMR demonstration sites are set up in Thailand because we wanted to start out small. We don't have a huge area to do this, but when we store these small sites, like a small shrimp farm that was abandoned, we see the mangroves coming back. And the local community starts seeing that, and they see more fish, more wildlife for themselves to harvest for their food, better for their village for protection against sea level rise. So this is where our successes are. And then they talk to the neighboring villages, and the neighboring villages start emanating our methods. And this is what we really want to try to do, is spread the word further. So these are small restorations, like 1 hectare, 2 hectares, even half a hectare sometimes. We get the community involved here because they're there on site. They will, over the years, be there so they can monitor this. And if they learn the skills for restoration, they can make sure it's done properly. And then nobody intervenes, because you need the local people to help monitor and manage the resource. Then you'll have success long term. This is about the honeybees. Again, this guy was involved in a village there that found out that the honey was produced in the mangroves. They were able to start a business there with over 300 hives, I believe it is. These are the women making soaps and shampoos, honey. They sell to hotels. I've got some soaps with me back there. Yeah, come on. And here's some of the restoration. See, here's an old shrimp farm, and we restored the hydrology here because it was being blocked. And if we restored that blockage by getting rid of the blockage thing, the sea's able to come back in, the tides can come back in, fresh water can go back out, then the mangroves can go back on their own because the seawater will bring in nearby seedlings from a nearby healthy mangrove forest. Seedlings float on the tides and come in and plant themselves in the right zones because mangroves grow in zones. They don't grow just anywhere, they grow in zones. And if they're in the wrong zone, they'll die, they won't flourish. So we're trying to promote the nature flourishing by doing its thing on its own, if we can. And then we all benefit from that. So here we're restoring what was the blocked hydrology here by hand. You can't use machinery, it's hard to do sometimes and expensive, but we got the village to get involved. And by getting involved, they did this for free. And they were able to work for us and restore their mangroves. And afterwards they saw the benefit of that restoration, increase fish, increase resources for themselves, and a healthier mangrove forest. It's a dirty work, but it works out, and people are willing to get into it. Here's a site we restored back in 2010, and the next slide, I think it's 2016. And you see the mangroves coming back. This is Abyssinia, there's a rhizophora back there, another species coming back on their own. They weren't planted by hand, they came back by the sea, restoring them. And this is more versatile, more resilient, which you want in your mangrove forest. You want it to be healthy, not to be a monoculture like we'll see in some places where they planted it. The ones that are successful monocultures are not successful mangrove ecosystems. They're a monoculture. There's a benefit to those only in certain aspects, but not all. We're trying to restore the ecosystem, which is more than the tree. In a sense, we're losing the forest for the tree.
What was the time lapse in this too?
6 years. This is 2016. You want to go back one, Monica? This is 2010 before that. Yeah. See, we did some work here. They built these little mounds to see if it would work better for the mangroves to grow higher up. Because the pond is dug 1.5 meters deep. So one of the issues with the abandoned shrimp farms is because it's too deep, the mangrove may not go back right away. It needs to build up the sediments. And that's one of the problems we have with the abandoned shrimp farms. We can reach the wall of the pond, the walls around the pond can be breached in certain places to allow the salt water to come in, the fresh water to come in, and sediments will eventually build up again, and the mangroves will come back on their own, if you can have the right to do that. The biggest problem we have is getting permission to restore these abandoned farms. Governments don't want to see us restore them oftentimes. Industries don't want us to see back to mangroves again. Even local people who own the land say, we don't want that back in mangroves again, because they may lose the rights to manage the land if it's a mangrove forest. The Navy or the Department of Forestry comes in and owns it then. So oftentimes we have to fight this kind of resistance.
It looks like the mounds actually help the mangroves there, is that?
The what now?
The mounds that they made actually help them?
We're testing that out with those mounds, because if you built a little bit higher, maybe the mangrove would grow in that mound.
Yeah.
And once the mangrove is established, it starts accruing soil around itself, which means you're building up the level of sediments.
Yeah.
So that was the idea for the mounds, an experiment, but it seems to have worked somewhat.
Okay.
Not all these are on mounds, some of them came back on their own, but the mounds, you can see some of them still existing there, and maybe nothing happened on those. Other mounds may have actually worked, but it's an experiment. Because the pond is dug 1.5 meters deep, that means the mangrove won't have the ability to come back on its own so easily. And we're training people to do this now. There's Dominic Woodhouse from England. He's working his PhD right now, but he's one of our lead restoration people as well. And we've done restoration around the world now, in Africa, Asia, Latin America. And we're seeing good results with all of our methods. But the biggest thing is it's small scale still. We'd like to scale it up if we could. So we're hoping to be able to join forces with Conservation International, for instance, in their work in Colombia. If we could join forces with bigger groups and get our methods in their hands. Recently we worked, this is in Tanzania, I believe, with Wetlands International in Tanzania. And they invited us over in Senegal as well as Tanzania. So some of the big groups like Wetlands International are coming forth now and asking us to train their people so they do it right. They're realizing we have a method that could work. This is basically setting up a line here, checking out what species of mangroves exist in that area, looking for the zonation. so we can figure out what's coming back in a normal forest, and we can apply that nearby forest ecology to the place we're trying to restore. Look at the hydrology, look at the level of the soils and so on, and figure out what trees may come back in our restored area. Yeah. And we're training people with classroom. These little placards contain pictures of failed, oftentimes, projects. We try to say, why did these fail? What happened here? What was wrong there? They try to point out what the problem was. So maybe they planted too close together, the wrong species. What do they see in those pictures so they better understand how to restore? They become better at monitoring, too, what to look for. This is in El Salvador. We're real proud of this. We went to El Salvador. This is all flooded because of a blocked waterway. We're not sure why it was blocked. Could have been several. It was an earthquake at one point. It might have raised the level of the channel, so blocked the water flowing out. When it rained, the mangrove was sitting in the water full time. They were drowning because the fresh water was drowning them. So we got there, and the people we taught the class to, after we left, did our method. They dug a canal, and it was 12 kilometers long to the ocean. And they dug a curvy canal, and they followed the old route system of the earlier canals, and they were able to bring back the seawater and bring out the flow and drain the flooded area. After so many years, you can see the result. This spilled in here to there. So in 7 years, you see the result of CBEMR, basically community managed resource. And it's the community doing this. This is a low-income community, fishermen and farmers in El Salvador, working with just tools by hand. They took out the mud with flat-bottom boats and took it out and put the mud elsewhere that they dug out the channel with. They opened up the canals there, and it worked. So we're real proud. We're teaching people now in Cuba and Panama and other places, the same group that we work with there called Asociación Mundial. We're teaching their neighboring countries some of this technique, which is really good for us to see happen. Now we're working with children. The next generation of decision makers are the kids. We have a curriculum that's about 300 pages long. It's in 15 countries now. We hope to spread it to other countries. There's 100 countries have mangroves, over 100. And they basically need to educate the children for the next generation of decision makers so they learn to appreciate and use the mangrove in a good way.
So what we do the video?
I know that I put the video if you don't have the voice.
How many languages is it again?
It's now in it's in 15 countries. It's probably in 7 languages, I'd say, maybe 8 languages. It's in Bangladesh, it's in the local language, Spanish in Honduras and Guatemala. It's in Brazil and Portuguese, Sri Lanka, it's in China, in Australia. So many languages. The Cayman Islands is where it started. Martin Keeley is our lead director for education. He designed the curriculum. And it's got information like games and field trips, experiments, information for the kids and for the teachers as well.
Do you want to see a little bit? Because we have a technical
We have a
problem.
video, you'll be able to hear the voice of the problem is.
Yeah, but maybe the...
Try it.
Just a little bit, maybe.
Good musical background in the drums there.
Just do the music for some reason.
The voice, I can't hear anywhere.
Yeah, the voice is cool because...
We're reaching about 10,000 children, about 5,000 teachers. And we try to teach the teachers how to use the curriculum. It's very important that we have the teachers learn how to use it correctly, otherwise it won't get used properly.
This is the curriculum actually, the book. How we can listen to music and not the
These are some experiments we do with the teachers and kids. maybe the salt underneath, so tasting the salt in the bottom of the leaf. They exude salt, they grow in brackish water. Other plants can't do that, so mangroves actually survive in brackish water. And they outcompete with freshwater plants that way.
That's not from the computer.
But they can live in freshwater too, but they can't outcompete the freshwater plants. So that's why they have the zone, that's their niche. I think it's curriculum in the US, it hasn't been in the US yet, so it's good to go here.
I really like the book. It's famous.
That's what
He's the one who does the curriculum.
He's out
Who started the project, Martin.
He's now at Suriname, actually. We did a ceremony up today on developing curriculum there. The curriculum is really important for us because we think the future generations can make the decisions correctly if they understand better the ecosystem. So working with kids is very important. We're trying to develop this as well for adults too, like eco-tour guides, for instance, so learning more about the mangroves, make the tours more interesting. And adults doing development, for instance, if a tractor pulls the dirt out and puts it on the mangrove roots, the mangroves will die. They won't be able to breathe if it's buried under the dirt. We need to talk to developers about how to better work with the mangroves too, so they're not killing the trees. So let's go to the next slide here. Again, working with people in the classrooms, teachers, teaching them how to use it, and then working with the kids after that. This is where the curriculum is now in different parts of the world. So we're trying to, we're trying to get into Africa right now. We hope to get into Senegal soon, or Tanzania, but we haven't gotten to Africa yet. And people using the experiments and the magnifying glasses, little things like that to study the mangrove, to look at it more closely. And this is basically towards the end of my talk here. Can you get involved? And we have several ways you get involved. That's supposed to be a natural heart that forms, that both of us doing that stuff.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So we have a website. You can see the website there, mangroveactionproject.org. And it's got lots of good information on there. You'll be able to watch the videos with the voices probably if you get on that site. And we have social media. Leo Tom is, he's in England right now. He's one of our social media experts. He's really good at getting our videos. He made all the videos for us. So, and then we have a subscribe to our newsletter if you'd like. The newsletter comes out bi-weekly. It's one of the oldest newsletters on mangroves that exist, and got a lot of good information from around the world. And then we have different projects we're working on here. This is in Tanzania just recently, in Germany. This team were there. So thank you for your listening, and hope if you have any questions, please ask. Actually, we can play the last video actually, because you don't need voice for the last one.
The last video?
Yeah, the last video has this.
Copy down your email.
Yeah, my email is alfredo@mangroveactionproject.org.
Okay, great.
Alfredo, yeah, I can give you my cards if you want it.
You have a business card?
Do you really plant your own nurseries, or do you harvest it from the?
We don't grow the plants, we let the seedlings come in naturally. If there's a seedling course, we will use.
Buy them and bring them in, right?
Yeah, we basically, the trees nearby, healthy forests will grow the seeds on their
Not a
own.
little bit and bring them in.
Yeah, they come out in the ocean tides, yeah. We don't do anything, we just restore the hydrology so they can restore themselves. If we have that, we will, but we don't have to now.
The commercial fig people, are they growing in the nurseries?
Yeah, they do that, yeah. We're discouraging that as a first step. That should be a last step. You don't want to grow nurseries are usually with
freshwater alterations that you can't do much about that affect mangroves, like agriculture, dams, deforestation, all that stuff.
It's a big problem. This one's just on top of that, it's very short, it's like 2 minutes.
So you don't need to
There's a war, massive damage, those that deep, stop the sediment, or long mangroves disappeared in those. Yeah. I heard there was there a big mangrove die-off in South Australia?
Yeah.
Was it what, drought or Greenpeace or?
The northern it was caused by, they think climate change.
Okay.
It got so hot, it dropped, and killed the mangroves.
There's North Australia?
Yeah, I think one. Yeah. Yeah, the nice one is the reason it's so cold.
Very clever.
That's
Yeah.
The video did that, so he did all the videos.